Hello, welcome to another episode of Field Screams Podcast. Today we will be talking about Friday the 13th Part 2. We covered the first Friday the 13th movie last episode, and there are some similarities in terms of how the story goes. Of course, they're still at Camp Crystal Lake. There is a killer. There's still horny teens running around. Camp shenanigans happen and murders pile up, and then there's a final battle between good and evil. Though I do think this movie is where we start to see a resemblance of the formula that we see movie after movie where they really nail it down. You start to see the structure really take shape in this movie. I mean, we finally get our killer that we stick with. Luckily, Pamela didn't come back. Luckily, it's not a whodidit story again. I mean, this franchise does not do well with those types of movies. We got Jason Voorhees, the killer, for the very first time, and he's going to stick around for a while. So let's talk about the first scene of this movie, because it's quite a brave start, if you want to call it that. We see our final girl from the first film, Alice, played by Adrienne King. She signed on to be in the sequel, not knowing how long her part would be, and unfortunately for her, her part was only about 5 minutes long. So they get her to come to set, and they don't really have a script ready for her, and they tell her to improvise the beginning of the scene, and you can tell it's improvised. I mean, this thing carries on for like 5 minutes of just nothingness. She gets on the phone, talks to her mom. Mom, I'm getting my life together, blah, blah, blah. She starts like cooking up coffee and doing all these different sorts of things, watches TV, and then finally she opens up the fridge. There's a severed head in there. And Jason busts in and kills her by sticking an ice pick in her head. Now, granted, I would say the pacing's a lot better in this movie than the first movie, but this opening scene is the exception. This carries on forever, but it was a pretty brave move to kill off the final girl from the first film. Now, granted, I wasn't really around when the first film came out, so I don't know if Alice was really a beloved final girl. I'm guessing a lot of people liked her, a lot of people saw the movie, so there's probably a lot of people that wanted to see her back, and I know the first one has its fans. So killing her off was a risky move. We see in Halloween 5, them trying to be risky and killing off Rachel didn't go so well. So I mean, this move could have backfired, but I don't think it really did for the second film. Now I do think a reason why killing off Alice wasn't such a bad move is because the girl they brought in to play the new final girl, Jenny Field, played by Amy Steele, does a fantastic job. Honestly, I think she's the best final girl in all the Friday the 13th movies. So that's why you really don't miss Alice from the first film. Most of the characters are pretty fun in this film. Paul, who is Jenny's love interest, also the boss of the camp counselors or camp leader, whatever they call him. He does a good job. We have another couple. Their names are Jeff and Sandra. You first spot them driving a huge truck in the beginning of the movie. The truck's so big it would make Al Gore flinch. But they're always doing shenanigans in the film. I mean, there's really not a down character in this movie. We have Ted, who's the long, lanky, weird guy in the movie. I could keep listing them off, but I'd be going on and on, because there are a lot of counselors in this movie. The abundance of counselors, they really kind of set the mood at the camp. There's a part where Paul's telling a campfire story and kind of gives you the brand new lore of Jason, on how he's still alive, and now he's running around trying to avenge his mother's death, which it doesn't really make sense when you watch the first one and the second one back to back. I mean, the first one even has Jason as, like, kid form, and then this one he's a grown, hillbilly, nasty man. But, I mean, we roll with it, though, because it's Friday the 13th. I mean, this isn't Shakespeare going on. After Ted jumps out, wearing a mask and yells "Hooga Booga," and gives all the counselors a scare, the counselors, they go and they start partying and messing around in the house, and we see our old friend, Crazy Ralph, from the first movie. And Jason kills him, just like that. it's almost kind of disappointing. You almost wish Crazy Ralph would have been a repetitive character throughout the franchise. I wouldn't mind seeing him 2 or 3 more times just running around telling people you're doomed. It's cheesy, but it's fun. But they killed him off, so that was the last of Crazy Ralph we get to see. Eventually, Paul and Jenny take a bunch of counselors to town to go to the bar. And they go there and they party it up. Ted goes with. There's a few counselors that stay behind, though. And of course, because they stay behind, they're going to be our victims in like the next 20 to 30 minutes until Paul and Jenny get back. One of the counselors that stays behind is Terry, who is supposed to be the hot girl in this movie. She wears super short shorts. Basically, all of her scenes kind of consist of close-up shots of her butt. And then she goes skinny dipping later in the movie. But Terry has a friend named Scott, who Scott's main role of this film is just being a pervert and following her around and kind of pulling pranks. I don't know, he's kind of just a weird dude. He takes his slingshot, slings rocks at her butt, and she's just kind of like, Scott, and then he's like hiding in bushes going like, really weird guy. Well, eventually the skinny dipping scene comes for Terry, and she's swimming naked in the lake, and good old Scott has a hilarious plan of taking her clothes and hiding them. Of course, she's like, Scott, and he's like giggling, being weird. And then he falls into a trap that Jason set. A rope goes around his feet, pulls him straight up in the air, and then he's screaming for help. And Terry runs away, trying to help him, gets a box cutter. And when she comes back, Jason slit his throat while he's hanging, and she turns around and kind of screams into the camera, signaling that Jason got her. So that's 2 counselors down. Then we have a character named Mark. Mark is a very athletic guy that is in a wheelchair. He wears a football jersey, and the reason he stays behind is he's talking to a girl named Vicky who has a mad crush on him. And he's just kind of like, nothing drags a party down like a drunk in a wheelchair. And you can almost hear a womp, womp, womp. In my head, I'm wondering, did this guy just get in a wheelchair? What a downer attitude. You can't avoid parties just because you're in a wheelchair. Like, it's not like people in the party are going to care, like, oh, great, the guy in the wheelchair's here. Oh, fantastic. Now, I highly doubt they're going to care, but they need a reason for him to stay behind. And because he stays behind, Vicky stays behind. So Vicky starts dropping line after line, trying to seduce Mark. And eventually he gets the hint that she really does like him. So she's like, I'm going to go freshen up. And she runs away and goes freshen up in her room. I think she sprays perfume on her underpants or something. A really weird scene. Which, by the way, she was 17 while making this film. And she even kind of made the comment in a documentary. It was Memories of Crystal Lake. She was like, I'm really surprised my parents didn't have to sign a waiver for me to film that scene. And there's some other stories that you just kind of hear about this movie. You're like, man, what was going on there while they were making this film? But we'll talk about that later. While Mark's waiting on Vicky, he's rolling around, and he decides to go out on the porch. And he goes out onto the porch, and he's waiting, and then the camera goes into like first-person point of view to where Jason's sneaking up behind him. But then when he gets killed, it doesn't really make sense because the camera's behind him. So you're picturing Jason's behind Mark, right? But then Jason hits him straight in the face with the machete, and the angle in which it hits him, you're kind of like, wait, if he was behind him, he couldn't make that hit happen. But again, it's Friday the 13th, so, you just kind of laugh it off. And you forgive it because the next sequence of Jason pushes Mark, and Mark then goes down these flight of stairs. Like, there's like 100 stairs, and Mark's like bouncing down as he's flying down the stairs, and there's a machete in his face. And the shot's pretty crazy. It's one of the greatest shots in this movie. It's kind of an iconic moment. So yeah, you forgive the misangle of the machete just because of the wheelchair guy going downstairs. When Vicky finally does come back to see Mark and she can't find him, she does find Baghead Jason. Yes, not Hockey Mask Jason. Hockey Mask Jason doesn't come until the third movie. So we see Jason with this bag over his head, and there's like one little slot that he can see through, and it was inspired by A Town That Dreaded Sundown. But Baghead Jason's a pretty cool look. I think it's scarier than the hockey mask myself. Then our next victims are Jeff and Sandra. Yes, the couple that drove the big truck in the beginning of the film. And I mean, they have other parts too. There's a part where they sneak off of camp to mess around, and unfortunately they find the dog mangled. So they have other parts in the film. But here they come back again, and they're about to fool around. Jeff's playing a harmonica, which makes Sandra come and visit him on the bed. Now, in the scene where they're making out, the girl who plays Sandra is again 17 in this film. And apparently, they filmed some nude scenes, and it wasn't until later down the road the production company heard word that she was 17 and ended up cutting that footage. And it's kind of like, isn't there someone who's supposed to be checking all this stuff before you start filming and all that? It just doesn't seem it's just not very good. Not a good situation. But in the Crystal Lake Memories documentary, it kind of gets worse because the guy who plays Jeff, whenever this kill scene happens, basically what happens is Jeff is on top of Sandra, Jason comes in and spears them both into the bed, which is like a double kill. And a lot of the gore of this scene was cut, unfortunately. I mean, this movie, there's like a minute of gore that is just cut from the film because of how popular the first one was. The MPAA really went at this film. So, I mean, this scene kind of suffered a lot. But whenever they filmed it just like Kevin Bacon's scene in the first movie, to where it was latex, and the guy who played Jeff, he was like underneath the bed, kind of standing up in an uncomfortable position. And he was having a lot of trouble filming this scene. So the sound guy walks up to him and he says, "Hey, open your mouth." And he does, and the sound guy blows powder into his mouth, which I'm guessing was cocaine. And the actor said he then was able to film the scene very easily. He said he could have filmed it 15 different times. Then he laughs about it. But I mean, that story on top of the two girls being 17, it's like, come on, man, who's watching this stuff? By this point, Jenny and Paul, down at the bar, they're ready to head back. So they tell the rest of the group, they're like, "Hey, we're going to call tonight, we're going to head back." Ted and everyone else stays. And that's where they stay for the rest of the movie. Like, it almost kind of blows my mind that they let this happen in a horror movie. Like, I'm just kind of picturing them in the writing room, like, okay, so Jenny and Paul come back, and they're going to confront Jason. Now, what about Ted and the others? And then they all kind of shrug, and they're like, well, we don't have a lot of time. I mean, we don't want too many kills in this movie, so let's just let them chill at the bar and they all live. And that's how this movie happens. So Jenny and Paul, they get back to Camp Crystal Lake. The lights are off, and I think they spot some blood in a room. I can't recall if they see the blood or not from the other kills at this point. But then Jenny says, "Paul, I think someone's in this room with us," and it is Jason. But it is a very tense scene, and I think at this part of the movie is where it is at its scariest moment in the franchise. I mean, it's filmed very dark, and it's just very suspenseful, and Jason comes out, him and Paul wrestle around, then Jason knocks Paul out, and then Jason's chasing Jenny around for like the final act of the movie. And it's a good chasing. I mean, all the scenes are dark. Jason's wearing the sag head. It's just a very good sequence. Eventually, there's a final showdown to where Jenny finds Jason's little shack. And that's where his mom's head is sitting, right in the middle of the shrine. Poor Terry, her dead body's over by Jason's mom's smelly head. And while Jenny's in there, Jenny pulls a move that is very clever. And by the way, Jenny is a very tough final girl. I mean, there's even a part in the chase scene where she pulls out a chainsaw, and when she does, even Jason's kind of like, holy crap, like I was not expecting that. Like, she puts up a fight. And then she gets to the shrine, and she picks up the head. No, she picks up the sweatshirt. That would be gross if she picked up the head. But she acts like Jason's mom, and she stands in front of the head. That's what happened. And she impersonates Pamela Voorhees and tricks Jason for a little bit, buys some time. And I mean, all the other final girls we get in this franchise, like, yeah, there's some fighters, but there's not as one as clever as Jenny. And the movie even does a little quick wink in the beginning where Paul's like, oh, you still majoring in child psychology? And that kind of explains why she's so smart. So yeah, Jenny pulls a quick one on Jason until Jason looks around and sees his mom's head still in the shrine. Jason's all like, how dare you impersonate my mama? And goes to attack Jenny. But then Paul comes back for more. He flies in, he wrestles around with Jason again. Jenny takes a couple swings at him. And I mean, the actor who played Jason, he actually got hurt like 3 or 4 times while making this film. He had to go to the hospital for one of them. While he was in the hospital, he had a fake machete in like his shoulder. And I mean, I think he did it as kind of a joke. You know, the hospital people were like, oh my gosh. And he goes, no, it's just my finger. But again, like how they made this movie, like it just seems reckless with everything they did. Between the ages of the girls, the sound guy blowing cocaine in people's faces, the guy getting hurt playing Jason. It was crazy times. But eventually Jenny puts an end to Jason. Or so we think. Yes, this movie does another jump scare at the very end, and it is a very good one. I think it's probably better than the first movie's jump scare, but I mean, the first movie is what inspired it. You know, the writer's like, oh, let's just do that again, and they did. Jenny and Paul are talking like, hey, we did it. They hear a noise at the door. They open up the door, and the dog from the beginning of the film runs in, and they're like, oh, a cute little dog, come here, and Jenny's like kneeling down, and then Jason explodes through the window, like grabbing her, and Jason looks like Chucky is a grown man mixed with Hills Have Eyes. Like, he looks pretty jacked up. I almost wish they would have kept this look for him longer in the franchise, because they kind of ditched the hillbilly inbred look after this movie. They did ditch it more and more as the films go. But I think it's kind of a scary look for him. I liked it. The movie ends with Jenny waking up, paramedics pulling her out of the house, she's yelling for Paul, and you kind of just wonder, what was really all a dream? You know, is Paul still alive? Is the dog still alive? That we'll never know, because no one's ever given an answer. And there's always theories and all this different stuff, like, yeah, Paul is alive, or no, Paul's definitely dead, because the dog was definitely dead in the beginning of the film, but then they had it come back. Therefore, all that was a dream. But I don't know, like, it's just kind of up to the person. I mean, you can comment what you think down below, and we can deal with it that way. At least on the bright side, we know that Ted and all the other counselors are nice and safe, probably still drinking at that bar. Well, that about wraps up my review for part 2 of Friday the 13th. I think it's a very good movie. It's one of the best in the franchise. I mean, I think there's a little golden period in this franchise, from 2 to 6, to which I really, really like the movies. And then I feel like they kind of start getting tacky, and they kind of lose its way. But I mean, 2 through 6, those are pretty solid movies. And I mean, they're all kind of alike, but they all have different stuff and different goofy things that separate them from the rest. But yeah, part 2, great film. And again, I'll say, I think it's probably the scariest one in the franchise. Feel free to tell me if you think it's also the scariest in the franchise, and if not, which one is. If you're still listening, please like and subscribe this video, this episode. It helps get the episode out to other people. I would greatly appreciate it. And thank you for listening. And until next time, guys.